area from which I grew up in. I think if it's possible to lower just this light here, then people would be able to see. I guess I could do the twinkle. My name is Sarah Lull, and I was born in 1830 in South Berwick, Maine. In 1833, 3 years later, I moved with my father, Dr. Nathaniel Lull, a graduate of Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, and my mother, Mary Ann Hale, to Dover, New Hampshire. I am one of 7 children. I have 3 brothers and 4 sisters. On August 7th, 1862, I wrote a letter to Miss Hannah Stevenson, a friend of mine from Boston. She was chief matron of the volunteer nurses at the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown, D.C., and I asked her if she needed help. The War of the Rebellion had been going on for about a year. On September 8, 1862, a penciled letter arrived from Miss Stevenson saying, "Crowded with work, come at once to Union Hotel Hospital, Georgetown, D.C., and closed by saying, perhaps I can give you only a room on the floor." That afternoon, my family sewed for me and helped me in every way in preparation for my leaving the next morning on the 11 o'clock train for Boston. Even Aunt Lydia Hale, whom I had been attending to because she had been sick on and off for many years, and who was most unwilling for me to go, presented me with a nice new carpet bag. On September 11, 1862, I arrived safely at the Union Hotel Hospital, and I took off my bonnet in Miss Stevenson's room and went directly with her to the ward, for she had many wounds of young soldiers to dress. One of the men of the New Hampshire 6th Regiment was very anxious to hear about what they were doing in New Hampshire. Dear Mother, September 25, 1862. Attending the wounds is only part of a nurse's duty, but it is the pleasantest part. Seeing that the ward is kept nice and that the attendants do their duty is the wearing part, particularly here in the old hotel where the wards are divided into little rooms. It is much work to take care of 25 here as it is of 100. This was a hotel that had been converted into a hospital for the war effort. It keeps you on your feet at all times. It is like keeping house with a very large family, always expecting company and having very poor health. We are up at 6 in the morning. We dress by gaslight. Our rooms are at the end of the ward and often just a curtain for privacy. The air is very bad and the ventilation very poor. One has little appetite for food. There is often no competent head in the wards. Good, bad, and indifferent nurses, surgeons, and attendants complicate things. A nurse ought to bring sheets and other sorts of things. It would be neither safe nor agreeable to use those that belong to the hospital. They are sent to the wash stained with matter from wounded limbs. The blanket I use now must have been washed, for it looks as if a bloody foot had been under it. In the first place, I will tell you what sort of a person a woman should be to make a good nurse. Kindness to the sick and wounded is, of course, one very important trait, but she must be reverent and dignified, as well as kind. A nurse ranks as a private, but patients are expected to obey their nurses. She must be very careful about what she says and does, making no observations that are not necessary on others. She must be able to live within herself. In many respects, it is a lonely life. There are many number of nurses who are what would be called very good in sickness, but who are miserable nurses here. You would not wonder that the Surgeon General employs all the Sisters of Charity that he can if you could see some of the nurses here. There were constant administrative conflicts between the hospital personnel as to who controlled the nurses. Miss Dorothea Dix was head of the Union Female Nurses. And although Florence Nightingale's style of nursing was known because she'd just gotten back from the Crimea in 1859, her first school of nursing started in 1860 in England, and there were no schools of nursing in the United States. They didn't develop until 1873, long after the war. So nurses could be anything. There was no such thing as a nurse and no such thing as a trained nurse. Consequently, everyone and anyone had claims on being a nurse. There were lady nurses, like me, Dix's hired nurses, religious order of nurses, such as Sisters of Charity and Sisters of Mercy, male nurses who were wound dressers, female nurses who accompanied the soldiers' regiments and were known as field nurses, camp followers, of course, wives and other family members who tried to be with their loved ones and would nurse their loved ones and their friends in the battle. Thus, there was a constant struggle for who had authority over the nurses, and I got caught in this battle of authority between Miss Dix and the surgeon in charge of our hospital. Dear Aunt Lydia, I am sorry to say that I cannot help those ladies who wish to come, but I cannot. A nurse's position is entirely a subordinate one. She is, in fact, a servant. Those who wish to come and need to be paid must write Miss Dix. Those who are not to be paid must write some surgeon. New hospitals are being opened all the time, and I know more nurses will be needed. A nurse is expected to take charge of a ward as soon as she arrives. I mention these things not to discourage anyone from coming, but merely that they may know what they are coming into. If you would like to come to this hospital, it would be necessary for you to write Dr. Bliss, offering your services and referring him to some responsible gentleman who can recommend you. Dr. Bliss has permission from the Surgeon General to engage his own nurses. He wishes to exchange those nurses who are paid for their services, that's Miss Dix's, for those ladies who are willing to work without pay, which is me and other volunteer nurses. Those of us who do not take pay for our services give money to the hospital fund. That is what Dr. Bliss wishes his volunteer nurses to do. Miss Dix, however, challenges all nurses who are not personally hired by her. Dear Aunt, last Sunday someone came up to our ward saying Miss Dix wished to see Miss Stevenson, she was my matron, immediately. Miss Stevenson went down. Miss Dix said, she said to her, "Who are those two young girls I see around the house?" I can't think of how she saw me, as I never leave the ward except on some errand. I certainly did not see her. Miss Stevenson told her, and Miss Dix raved because her authority had been interfered with, as she said. Mrs. Ropes, who was talking to Miss Stevenson, said she did not see how Miss Stevenson could endure Miss Dix talking to her in that way. But Miss Stevenson said that she's gotten used to it by now. I forgot to say Miss Dix was not consulted about my coming was because there was not time, and they knew perfectly well that she would say no. It was in accordance to the advice of the surgeon, who was then at the head, that Miss Stevenson sent for me. The boys say that it is well for Miss Dix that she should not come into the ward at this time. Miss Dix had very rigid rules, and I would have been too young. I was 33, and you had to be at least 35, preferably very ugly, definitely married, and hopefully many children before you could be engaged in her services. Which is interesting, as Miss Dix was a spinster, although she was in her 50s. When Miss Stevenson left to go to Toolsville, Miss Dix told her, "Now, Miss Stevenson, I want you to be very careful, for you talk and laugh very loud, and you talk a great deal. I want you to remember that you are nothing but a nurse and have nothing whatsoever to say to Dr. Crosby." Well, Miss Stevenson told Dr. Crosby of it after she'd been there only 10 minutes, and they had a great laugh about it. It is reported that Miss Dix is to be removed very soon. Miss Dix was not removed very soon. She lasted through the whole war with many, many conflicts. I did not like Miss Dix's nurses, and I write that no one of a respectable nature would have those nurses in their home. The hospital nurses, however, that I worked with were very kind to me. They gave me tea and toast, and two of them, respectable women, made room for me at the table and seemed to think of me of their special case. You cannot think of how surprised they looked when I took my seat at the head of the table. Two very pleasant ladies, Miss Ewing of the linen room and Miss Worthington, a young doctor, sat there, but they need to take their meals in their rooms. The doctor from Maine said that he was glad to see that the ladies of the higher walks of life had come to their senses and found out that there was something for them to do. He was referring to the nurses here. I did get discouraged, though, and I write in the early stages of my career there. I have a sort of feeling as if I'm being tried here as an experiment. I'm so afraid that I shan't turn out good. Mrs. Keene on Ward K is a very inefficient and very disagreeable person. She says, "I see very plainly that preference is given to young nurses in this hospital." Then she looks at me as if she would like to put her foot on me. There were a large array of personnel in the hospitals. At the head was the chief surgeon. Then there were the contract surgeons who worked at short-term and on contract base. There were medical officers of the day. Those were the physicians who gave the medical orders. There were ward masters, ward stewards, convalescing soldiers who acted as ward attendants, lady nurses, wound dressers, chaplains, volunteers, teachers, family members, and friends of the soldiers, etc. There was an array of personnel in the Washington hospitals. Dear Mother, you know we have invalid soldiers for attendants. Each ward has a colored man who sweeps and mops, etc. Our colored man is all the time slipping away. We can't depend on him at all. We had 3 soldiers detailed to us. A small New Hampshire boy who worked so hard that he made himself sick. A man who went from the penitentiary to the army and who, as soon as he found out that he had to go to work, took to his bed. And then we have Henry, the wound dresser. Henry deserves to have his name written in gold. All day he dresses the wounds of the suffering men with the utmost of patience and cheerfulness. He not only takes excellent care of the wounds, but he arranges the men in the most comfortable way. You would think that a woman had arranged the bed. He takes great pride and pleasure in taking good care of the wounds, and he makes the men comfortable. The patients regard him as a real friend, as well they may. And it should be noted here that at the same hospital that Sarah was working in, the most famous wound dresser of the Civil War was Walt Whitman. I don't think she was referring to him, but they passed courses in the same hospital. October 10th, 1862. Dear Aunt Lydia, I should not be surprised if we should change hospital soon when this set of patients leave. If we go, we should likely be going either to Washington or near the battlefield. I did not go near the battlefield, but I went to was moved to the Union Hotel, or to the Armory Square Hospital in Washington itself. I left the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown, what Louisa May Alcott had called the Hurly-Burly House, in October, and nursed for the rest of my 3 years in a newly built military hospital called Armory Square Hospital in Washington. Work in the Armory Square Hospital was an enormous improvement over the old hotel-style hospital that I had been in. By November of '62, I was well established at Armory Square. The hospital was located opposite the Smithsonian Institute. It was a great improvement in every way over the Union Hotel. Dear Mother, the ward here at Armory is bright and cheerful, looking compared to the dismal conditions at the Union where the air was so bad. This hospital is new and an excellent one. Armory is nearly always filled, as it is near the boat landings and the railroad station. It was, in fact, a major triage hospital for the Union during the Civil War. The surgeon, ward master, and attendants of my ward are very kind and attentive to the patients. The patient's comfort depends so much on the surgeon. Armory Square had a competent chief surgeon, Dr. William Bliss of Michigan. He was good to his nurses, and he encouraged them to go out on fresh air and take walks every day. However, not all surgeons were that good, as many were documented, and we had our share. This is a common caricature of the idea of the average soldier to the surgeon. May of '63. Dear Mr. Hale, Mr. Hale was my uncle, a senator in the Congress, or in the Senate, from New Hampshire, who had been down there for many, many years and was very prominent. And because of him, I had access to a lot of social functions and a lot of prominent, distinguished people. Dear Mr. Hale, last evening we became terribly worried about our hospital affairs because our surgeon in charge had had so little experience. We like him very much, but he is far too young to have charge of this large surgical hospital where the worst cases are left. There was a man here who had burst an artery in the leg and had a secondary hemorrhage. The limb began to mortify 2 or 3 days ago, and it was of the opinion that it ought to be taken off. The night before last it bled again and the leg was amputated. The man lived until about 3, but never recovered from the effects of chloroform, a very common complication of surgery. We heard it was the first operation of this kind that the surgeon ever performed. There was very little probability that the man would have lived under any circumstances, but we felt that the way in which it was managed showed such a want of experience that something must be done for the sake of the wounded that we expect. Something was done, and the surgeon was removed, and an older surgeon was put in charge. These women were very effective in passive persistence, Florence Nightingale's model of just hammering and staying with it. And as one nurse wrote to Sarah that if nothing was done shortly, she herself would visit President Lincoln and see that the job was done, to say it was done. This happens to be a drawing by a soldier, not Sarah's collection, but somewhere else, and it shows a soldier being receiving chloroform. And you can't quite see this because it's not very clear, but those are limbs that have been hacked off and are just pushed under the table. And many times, of course, there was blood on the floor, and people were slipping and sliding all over the place, and they never washed their hands and they never changed their clothes. So needless to say, infection was a common occurrence. It was amazing the people that survived. I steadily improved with confidence, though, and I write later on, it takes a month or two for a nurse to become perfectly accustomed to her duties. It is like a trade that must be learned. My friend, Miss Lull is from Boston, and was a very good friend of mine, and a friend of she was of the famous Lowells of Boston. And I often say that what a very different thing our work is now compared to what it was when we first came. Then we were anxious all the time, and our work was difficult for us. Now we can do it with ease and enjoy doing it. I feel now that I can see that the patients are taken care of so much better than I could at first, because we learn constantly more about the diseases and can tell whether we have a good surgeon or not. Let me tell you about some of my several outstanding patients. There was a young boy in our ward named Seaman Bartholomew. He had been a year in the service and was just 15 years old when he was brought into the hospital with a fractured thigh and a broken arm. I will give you his story as he told it to me. His mother was a widow. She had allowed him to go on a visit to an aunt. While visiting the aunt, he ran into some recruiters. The recruiters got him to enlist, and they would enlist anyone, as this cartoon shows, no matter how drunk or how stupid or how illiterate. There was a price on people's head, and you could pay people with conscripts, so enlisted men, or getting men to enlist, meant money. Before he reached the Army, however, he was seized with measles and lung fever and was left at a hospital. But he soon recovered and joined his regiment, the New York Cavalry Regiment, where he was a bugler until his regiment was very much cut up and dismembered. This is they gave him a horn and told him to blow. He probably might have been placed as a bugler because he had some musical ability. And then the buglers, of course, were very much in charge of, now this boy was probably 14, leading them into, like the color bearers, leading them into battle. And this was his regiment before it got dismembered, and this was the cavalry, the New York Cavalry, which became chopped up. This was a common way of battle. A mass of horses and horses, men, and sabers racing into cannon fire. And the cannon fire was very effective at long range and could annihilate a regiment in about minutes. It was very quick. It was a tactical error that no one caught on to, was mass humans against artillery. After his regiment was dismembered, Bartholomew still survived. Therefore, he was given a musket. He became a sharpshooter when he had the musket. And during the Battle of Petersburg, young Bartholomew was in a tree with two other sharpshooters. This was a common way of shooting, was either from a tree or from a fence. A shell hit the tree, throwing it to the ground, and the two men were killed instantly. Bartholomew was thrown onto some bushes and was at first insensible. As he became conscious, he could hear men burying the dead around him. But he was too weak to call for help. He thought that he had remained there about 2 days when some men found him. One of the men called himself a surgeon and told the boy that he would not live more than an hour or two, and that he had better let him take his watch and his money and send it to his mother. Bartholomew gave him the watch and money to the pretend surgeon. His mother never received them, and on inquiring, no such surgeon could be found. The watch and money had been given to Bartholomew a few days before by a brother who was mortally wounded to send to his mother. Bartholomew, however, is a very intelligent boy. He's always in good spirits. He was very much impressed by his escape from death and did not seem to think much of his injuries. Mrs. Hooper, the matron on the floor, sent a rolling chair that Bartholomew was very much excited to try out. That's the rolling chair, wheelchair. When he first got into it, he nearly upset it by starting off in such a hurry and always turning the wheel so fast that no one walking could keep up with him. He would look down admiringly on the wheels, talk about the price of the chair, and say that he thought that he had got the worth of the money out of it himself. Sometimes he took a feather duster and rolled the chair between the beds to dust the tables of the patients. When newspapers were left for the patients, he carried them to those in bed. He carried cups of water and did all sorts of errands in that rolling chair. His recovery was rapid, and he was soon on crutches. There was quite a difference, however, between the wounded and the sick for patients. And an example of a sick patient is as follows. Dear Aunt, my typhoid patient keeps me a good deal confined. He got over his fever and pneumonia and got dreadful diarrhea. The doctor says that it will be a miracle if he gets well. We give him a tablespoon of beef tea every hour, a tablespoon of brandy and water every 2 hours, and 2 opium pills every 4 hours. I don't believe you ever saw anyone as thin as he is. He cries and moans so when he is washed, he is so sore. He has been a very trying case to me, as the doctor says as much depends on the nursing of what I can do as what he can do for himself. You can't imagine the difference between such a patient and a wounded man. And if you think that doctors' writing has changed over 125 years, this is the order, as illegible as ever. Last Monday afternoon, the cavalrymen were brought into the ward, those who had been wounded on a fight on Sunday. They were brought in just as they were shot down. Their clothes were all bloody. One of them, a young man of 21 years, had a large piece of shell sticking out of his arm. It was taken out after he had laid in bed, and its weight was nearly 1.5 pounds. This young man utterly refused to take any wine. He said that he had never tasted any liquor before, and he would not take drink. When he spoke of his unwillingness to take stimulants, at that time alcohol was thought as a stimulant. It is in fact a depressant, but it was definitely a medical treatment in terms of stimulants. He said that he had suffered so much from the effects of intemperance. His father had been drunk and was cruel to his mother and him. The surgeon had to tell him that his life depended on it before he could be persuaded to take any. This case is a very critical one, but he has a good constitution and is very calm. Dear Aunt, they brought in more dreadful wounds yesterday and brought in a great many dead. Some of the wounds are in dreadful condition. One arm was so mortified that the flesh dropped off, and as many as a pint of maggots were taken out. It is impossible to keep the maggots out from some of these wounds, for they multiply in less than a minute. You may think that it must be very dreadful for a nurse to have a number of badly wounded men brought in, but there is so much to do at such times that there is no room for feeling. A message was brought that 600 sick had just been arrived from the front. Men were sent out to help bring and lift them from the cars to the ambulances. Among them was a little drummer boy. He was delirious and cried when he has to take his medications. It was not uncommon for both North and South to use very young children to play instruments for bugles or for drums. One patient we had was wounded through the lungs, a very lethal type of injury. He was as nervous as a very nervous woman, and so frightened that it was painful to see him. I found out after he died that he had been engaged, and upon coming to the hospital had written to a girl to say that he was a mere wreck and would not hold her to the engagement. He received a very heartless letter from her saying that she had never considered herself engaged or bound to him since he had enlisted. His wound was fatal, I suppose, but he had been doing so well that they'd had some hope of his recovery. But after he received that letter, he seemed to lose all courage. He refused to take his medicines and stimulants, even though we told him that they were his only chance to recovery was in taking them. He died a few days later. We lost a patient this afternoon. He has been here since the Battle of Wilderness. He died of a compound fracture. His mother has been with him for weeks. She seemed a very nice old lady, but quite broken down with sorrow. He was conscious to the last, bid us all goodbye, and he said to me, "I hope to meet you in heaven," just as calmly as if he had asked to go to his house in Philadelphia. I shall miss him very much. But there were physical hazards as well as emotional hazards in nursing. Consequently, I did not escape illness during my 3 years as a nurse. In January of '63, I contracted varicose, a mild case of smallpox, from a patient who had had it. And I survived. The patient died, but 2 other people who contracted smallpox died from it. Washington was full of smallpox. Even President Lincoln had it. But I recovered and returned to work. But then in July of '64, I had to take time off to rest after being worn out from taking care of so many sick patients. Washington was cold and dark in the winter, but the summer was worse. It was very hot and humid, and in August of '64 I write, "It is very warm here. My hand is not dry enough to hold a pen comfortably." Besides the heat, summer brought out the best of the bugs. Dear Mary, cockroaches are in everything. We don't think much more of them than we do of flies. With bed bugs it is the same. It is so uncomfortable here where we are now. The walls are to be covered with poison today to try and kill the bed bugs. A mosquito was singing in my ear last night. There is a cat in this ward with 2 kittens who stays in the ward at all times and gives it quite a domestic look. But the military life has a very demoralizing effect upon cats. You rarely see a cat in the service wash herself. I have seen our cat wash her face once, but she does take pains to have her kittens make a good appearance. But then she is a very superior cat and does good service in helping drive away the enormous rats that infest the hospital. A patient in the ward told me that one night while he was half asleep, he thought that he felt something soft and silky on his neck. Presently it occurred to him that it might be one of those rats. He raised his hand to brush it, and away flew an enormous rat, which jumped on the floor. Washington was filled with dust, dirt, drunk, chaos, Southern sympathizers, Southern spies, and always under a siege mentality, because they were very, very close to Richmond and very close to all the surrounding battles. So they were constantly ready for an attack. Rebel bombardment was always a reality. Dear Lydia, we had quite an excitement this afternoon owing to the burning of too much powder among the waste swept out by the hospital. It made the greatest crash. Everybody who had legs to run on ran. Of course, it was reported that the hospital was blown up. There was a feeling at first that the rebels might be shelling the city. But they didn't, and we continued on. Later I wrote, "There has been a steady cannonading heard all over this morning. We don't know whether it is nearby practicing or whether it is on the battlefield, but we can feel the jar of the guns. I just saw a lady who says that there was great excitement on the avenue and that it was said that there was fighting. I can see the signal lights throughout the night. It makes the army seem very near. Dear Aunt, I forgot to tell you in my last letter to ask you about a guard. You know we have one walking day and night a few feet from our window of our room. I shall never be able to do without one, to guard under my window at home. Had I better get a number of soldiers detailed as guards and bring them home with me? Or do you think a guard could be raised in Dover, New Hampshire? I wish you would let me know immediately." But not only was there fighting among the Union soldiers and the rebels, there was also fighting among the Union soldiers themselves. Dear Nate, there was a fight this morning near us, and one soldier shot another. They were stragglers from a brigade, drunk and with loaded muskets. Nobody could tell when they would fire. It took a long time before the other guards came to break it up. It was very frightening. The war marches on, and the casualties get worse. We have been in constant expectation of new arrivals of the wounded. One evening this week, after we had gone to our house, we had heard the bugle call announcing the arrival of the sick and wounded. It was a dark night, and the rows of trees by the walks before the hospital appeared as if illuminated by street gaslights. Drawn up under the trees was a long line of ambulances. They waited some time, but the men were not received here, so they had to go on to some more distant hospital. And the battles rage. Dear Mother, orders came today to prepare to receive 2,000 patients in the district. So we expect to have to send our men off and to get ready for new men. It is the most extensive preparations are being made for the wounded now. Nearly all the hospitals are to be engaged. Hospital tents are put up on the grounds here. They are to hold 15 patients each. Usually those were patients who had gangrene or smallpox. We are thinking all the time of the next battle and of the wounded that are to arrive. Part of our surgeons have gone to the battlefield and will probably be back tonight or in a few days. The wounded are brought in, for the most part, over corduroy roads. The suffering is indescribable. Corduroy roads are logs, tiles, tiers that are laid down over the dirt, and then the wagon goes over it. And you can imagine the comfort of riding over logs when you're sick, wounded, injured. Often they are not able to keep in a direct road, but first go in one direction and then in another to escape the fire of guerrillas. This shows a wagon going over some of the roads. And many of the soldiers would prefer to die or get out and walk a mile along the way than ride over those roads. And these are guerrillas attacking a wagon train, which is not uncommon for skirmishes. We are filled now and overflowing. The attendants sleep on the floor. The tents are so filled, and so is the chapel, and still we have to take them in. In between the lulls of battle, however, there were other hordes of people in and out of the hospital whom we had to contend with, and those were the visitors. We had a visit from 4 surgeons of the Russian fleet. They were sensible and pleasant gentlemen, and I was very impressed by their gold braids and gold crosses and how they snapped to attention when anyone addressed them. They were a very distinguished-looking group. However, now it is difficult for anyone to get into the hospital because the guard is so strict. So many visitors are well-meaning, but many are just curious. Of course families come, and some are very helpful, but some are also nuisances. To give you an idea of how many visitors we had, this morning 1,200 tried to get into this hospital. But life in Washington was not all death and drudgery. Although I write home that nurses do not attend parties, I made exceptions to grand social events. Dear Mother, this morning Mr. Hale called to invite Miss Lull and me to go to the front. There's a party there at Meade's second headquarters, and he is giving, and it is expected to be magnificent. A building has been raised for it, and it is said that the supper is to cost $3,000. A car full of ladies and gentlemen went down this morning. I was fortunate not to have to ride in this contraption. This is an open buckboard with chairs over a rutted road. But because I had influence, we have passes in transportation and could have had 75 ambulances to go anywhere we were assigned to for this special occasion. I told Mr. Hale that he would have to take us to the party in our plain black silk. He said that he thought that these were the prettiest dresses in the world, and that if we had been party-going ladies, he would not have undertaken to go with us. It is fortunate that although the ward is full, I have done very sick, so my going will only make it hard for my attendants. We left Washington and we traveled down through to Virginia. It took about 6 hours to reach our destination in Virginia. Along the route, we saw the remains of long trains that had been burnt, some by the rebels and some by the Union men. And this is how they would do it. They would take a work crew, take poles and bend the railroad tracks so no one could use them. We passed miles of bent rails taken up by the rebels in Meade's retreat last autumn. We also saw unburied horses lying on the ground. And sometimes we saw half-eaten ones, and we saw multitudes of cairn-filled crows. This is not too clear, but it shows a hill where dead soldiers and dead horses, and I guess you can't see the birds very clearly, are around at this carnage. We could see regiments encamped along every little hill. The regulars were encamped a short distance apart along the roadside. When we arrived at Meade's headquarters, there were officers and soldiers riding on horseback, galloping back and forth in every direction. There were parties of soldiers who had come from neighboring camps to see the arrival of this large and distinguished group from Washington. The party was the grandest and greatest occasion, and I had one of the best times I have ever had. There were very few line officers there. They were mostly all generals with their staffs. We saw nearly all the generals in the Army of the Potomac. It may seem strange to those at a distance that they should have, or they should wish, to have a party when the time for battle cannot be very far off. But when we were there, it seemed rather as if they had invited their friends along for the sake of seeing them once more. I observed the action going on during the grand ball. I liked Meade's face. It was thoughtful, kind, and serious-looking. He looked very pale from his last illness. The most interesting part of the evening to us was while we watched a long conversation between Meade and Kilpatrick as they stood apart from all the others. They were evidently describing movement. We left the hall between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, and I sent for a program, which I took for the sake of keeping, as of course I did not dance. Traditional wallflower. Of course we enjoyed it. Seeing so much, we could not have had a better opportunity to see the generals. It was the greatest occasion of the sort that they have ever had. In the next morning, we watched the second corps of Meade's military corps with a military review. While the grand review was taking place, we amused ourselves by watching Vice President Hamlin, who seemed to be taking a nap on his horse. We were very much entertained with his dancing the evening before. Might explain the nap on the horse. Later that day, we could see on the hills in the distance where the rebels were encamped. With a few spyglasses, you could see their earthworks and their camp. They said that the rebels had undoubtedly seen our review that day, which undoubtedly was put on so that they would see our review that day, might be added. We went to bed wondering if there would not be a raid, and thinking as the canvases of the tents flapped in the wind that perhaps the rebels had come. There was little time to be away from the hospital, but it was essential to have a change of time on and off, and to get away from the hospital work and routine. I attended my Christian duties both inside and outside the hospital, and when the ward was quiet, and in the hospital setting, and on my light days, I taught the soldiers how to read, how to write, and how to do arithmetic. And I read to them. And I was so pleased to see their faces light up with interest, particularly when I read from the New Testament. I took several trips to the freedmen's villages in the area around Arlington. The freedmen's villages were ex-slaves who had all clustered into Washington in little hovels. While there, I attended a contraband, another name for an ex-slave's wedding, and I observed religious education classes. I even taught a few and helped out. And I visited their living quarters. There were also other Washington social functions that I participated in, since my uncle, Senator Hale, had brought me papers of introduction. In April of '64, I attended a reception hosted by President and Mrs. Lincoln. There was a great crowd, reportedly 10,000 people, who crushed to shake the hands with the President. I had never been in such a huge gathering or seen so many people in my entire life. So I just retired to the East Wing and watched the stream go through. The most astonishing-looking people were there, men with boots over their pants who looked as if they had been out digging in the street. And the President looked wearier and wearier towards the end of the night. The War of the Rebellion ended on April 9, 1865, but my duties had not yet ended. I was on a furlough in New Hampshire when an urgent note dated April 15th arrived saying, "Your services are much needed. I hope you will come at once, Dr. Bliss." A friend added, "The President has been assassinated at the theater, and the villain has escaped. The whole hospital is in an uproar." I attended Lincoln's wake in the Capitol Rotunda, and it was a very solemn occasion, and Lincoln's face looked like a murdered man. There were wilted flowers there at the time that I was at the Rotunda, and it seemed appropriate for such a sad occasion. I stayed at the Armory Square Hospital until August of '65, and then returned to Dover, New Hampshire, with the spoils of war. A dog named General, it was a poodle, and an orphan boy named John. I stayed in Dover and commuted between Dover and Boston until I was 93 years old and died in 1913 on the eve of World War II, having served in the Civil War, one of the greatest wars in the United States. Now I'll take questions. There are lots of things that I haven't, that I can explain more, but if you want to talk of what she did, yeah.
Oh, how did she maintain herself financially?
Oh, she's very wealthy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, which through the letters, it kept cracking me up because I was looking at it from a nursing perspective, and I saw one of the roots of nursing's problems was many things that Sarah kept saying. Repeatedly, she's talking about Dix's hired nurses, the nurses who take pay for their services, the money, the money, the money. And I think, Sarah! She's driving me crazy. Then I found out that Sarah got paid. All volunteer nurses, of which Dix's nurses were volunteer nurses, got paid. They got a stipend from the government, and they got a pension at the end. The difference was that Dix's nurses kept their money. The lady nurses of Sarah's vintage, who were wealthy, gave their money back to the hospital fund. And Sarah is just irate that people who serve the poor, who serve the sick and the wounded, should get paid. And oh, Sarah, that sounds like modern nursing, you know. What do you need to get paid for? Why should you go on strike? You know, I thought, this is the roots of the problem right here. And she repeatedly is miffed by that, and she separates herself completely from accepting money and payment for services to the wounded and the sick. And that was, but she was very wealthy. She was a family of, the Hales were, I don't know where they made their original money, but they were there in the Revolutionary War. And her sister married the Sawyers of the mills there in Dover. And she herself had a lot of money.
Did she marry?
No, she never married, which is interesting. And a lot of her friends did. And it didn't seem to bother her. And I have never been found the riddle of to why she wrote about the grand ball and saying, and of course I did not dance. I mean, that's a riddle that has been hanging around for a long time. I sort of suspect at the age of 25, women who were not married just were not married, and that was it, you know. And I don't think she sounded, because she had money, it was not critical that she be married. And she does make a reference to her sister who was being courted by somebody in Dover. Oh, this is much later. And the sister didn't marry either, and she made some comment about, well, why should Lydia be interested in this man, you know, something like that. One reason that Dix, by the way, did not want to hire young nurses or did not want to hire pretty nurses was, of course, the obvious connection, which the Greeks knew, between Mars and Venus. You know, you get a woman and a man together in a stressful situation, and you've got, you know, romance and whatever. But Sarah never mentioned it. She certainly did have a lot of soldiers wrote to her, and one of them writes to her. She wanted to work only with the privates. She did not want to work with the officers, and she makes a point of this repeatedly. And I never quite knew why, except I don't know why. She certainly would not have had any romantic interest in any privates. I know that from her background. But a couple of them write to her begging her for her picture, and I think she did send them because along with letter writing, picture taking was very popular. And he keeps writing and writing, and as you're reading, you say, "Come on, Sarah, send him a letter. When you send this poor guy a picture, you know." And I think she did, because she's a very kind-hearted person. But in one of his letters, he says, "I will send you a picture of me as soon as I get paid and can go down and have it taken." And it's a very tender type thing, you know. He says, "I want your picture so I can at least look at you and feel as though, you know, you are my good friend and I want to, you know, talk to you." And they're very formal. At least they are formal in writing to her. And she was one of the relatives of one of her patients writes to her and says, "My son says that you must be from a very prominent family because so many distinguished visitors are always calling on you." And I think she was. That was very true. So she had a lot of connections.
Today, who's the closest relative?
I don't know.
You know?
No, there is a man. I haven't been able to trace down anyone yet. I've heard that her uncle, or great uncle, was in a nursing home, but I'm not sure. I haven't traced them back. All these were a whole collection of letters that she wrote, and they were in the Frost Sawyer collection for years, and they just turned them over in 1980, I think, to the Historical Society in New Hampshire. They went through all her letters and did a beautiful job. It took them about 3 years to sort it all out in chronological order. And I happened to come across it. I'm interested in nurses in the wars. I happened to be looking for World War II nurses. I wasn't at all interested in the Civil War. And a friend of mine said, "Gee, I heard they just got a collection of letters from a Dover Civil War nurse. You know." She said, "Why don't you go take a look at it?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I'm not too interested in the Civil War." So I'll go down, you know. So I went down, and when I started reading, I thought, this is a gold mine. I mean, this lady is fantastic. You know, she's just an average person in that sense. But the letter writing of the Victorian era has come and gone, and they're just elegant writers. It's just unbelievable. Now, she wrote all these letters with the idea of them saving them, which they did, with the idea that she would publish them as a story years later, and she did. In 1873, she published 10 pages of her memoirs in the Atlantic Monthly, which I think is considered quite a coup. The Atlantic Monthly at that time was quite a literary magazine, and her articles were there along with Mark Twain's. And so whatever her style of writing was, and whatever tale she had to tell was obviously considered appropriate for her peer group. And it's really funny because Louisa May Alcott was in the same Union Hotel as Sarah was, but Louisa May was only there for a month, and then she got sick with typhoid and had to go home and never came back. And Louisa May published from her experiences the very popular hospital sketches, which ran in the Boston paper for almost a year, and they were extremely popular. And I read them, and they're very funny. They're kind of sarcastic, and of course Union Hotel was a dump, and even Sarah admits that. And so she ridicules a lot of the things that went on, and they're extremely funny. But years later, Miss Stevenson, who was there when Louisa May was at Union Hotel and when Sarah was there, wrote to Sarah and said, I appreciated your story in the Atlantic Monthly on your stay in the hospital. And she said, it was very true. She said, ... Unlike Miss Alcott's hospital sketches. And I thought, oh, she didn't think much of Alcott, which is true. I mean, if you were a nurse and worked nurse through the war and you did that whole thing, you couldn't find a whole lot of humor and ridicule in some of the scenes where Louisa May had more. She had that sharp kind of author's skill, journalistic skill. And even Louisa May admits, she says, this is my own opinion, and I realize I'm ridiculing. There was many good people, but this is my reaction to her study. And Walt Whitman also wrote along the same time. As a matter of fact, he wrote, I was reading some of his things, and they were, Walt Whitman and Sarah were in the same Armory Square. I know that because they described some of the same scenes, where she describes the scene of the ambulances out under the streetlight. He writes a very similar type of thing. When she writes about seeing the guns blasting in the air, he writes a similar thing. And it's fun to parallel. And I was reading one of his little essays on a patient, and I'm reading about this young boy shot through the bladder. He'd been there for a year. Everybody loved him. He was lonesome, and everybody mourned his death. And I thought, gee, that guy sounds familiar. And I went back and read through some of Sarah's letters, and it was the same patient she had, and she wrote a similar parallel story, And that's what's really fun, and you say, oh, I know what you're talking about. What I was surprised about was she came back with a black orphan boy. I was very surprised at that, and I don't know much about that at all, except that she occasionally in her letters asked if her sister would like her to bring home a child. And I don't think, they did not use them as servants. They were not brought home as servants. I don't think he lasted too long. This boy was about 8 years old. He grew up on the streets of Washington, D.C. He was a wild child. I can imagine him in Dover, New Hampshire. I think what she did is she didn't have him in her home. I think what they did is they put him in a boarding school and paid for their way, and then she would visit him. But a couple of years later, I was reading a letter that the private who found her, this boy, writes and says, "Dear Sarah, I'm sorry you're having so much trouble with John." And she never mentions him again. He's not in her will. I suspect he just, after a couple of years, just went back to Washington, D.C. He couldn't stand yeah.
Do you know what religion she might have?
Oh, yeah, she's a, St. Thomas Episcopal. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and she's a very, she was not Quaker. She does talk about the Quaker ladies. As a matter of fact, she was very prominent in the Dover Episcopal. She gave them the land for their rectory in their church. And at one point in her life, early on, she's toying with the idea of Catholicism because an aunt writes to her and says something about, what is this I hear about your Romanization or something like that. You're going to be a Romanizer. So I forgot what the slang word was for a Roman Catholic. And her, obviously, that didn't go over too well. Sarah did, before the war, she did want to go out and teach in Ohio. I know that because another aunt writes to her and says, I'm sure your family is very pleased that you have decided not to go out to Ohio to teach. So she was ready for adventure. It was pretty obvious about that. But still, it was quite an undertaking for her. She's a pretty independent type of person. This outfit, by the way, is a recreation of, it was done by a nursing student in New Hampshire Hospital. And when they closed, they gave it to UNH because they're collecting stuff. And it's a student nurse did it as a project. And it's a copy of Florence Nightingale's outfit. So it's a real, and they did wear these black. Black was the dress of color for hospital setting. She would never have worn anything quite so fancy. I mean, she wouldn't have had this on, and she wouldn't have had all the ribbing. It would just been plain. She did have, what was interesting was she talked a lot about the soldiers carving things for her, including, she's very proud of the marble crosses that they carved for her. She's extremely proud of her marble crosses, and as you notice in the picture, she had one. And it took me a long time to figure out what a marble cross was. I mean, I just couldn't envision it. I looked all over for one. I couldn't find one. I couldn't even begin to imagine how something would be so soft, marble would be so soft that the soldiers could carve it, and they carved it with statuettes. And I spent a couple months looking and got nothing. I'd come out with these Celtic crosses and these Gaelic crosses and these metal things and all kinds of crucifixes. Couldn't find it. I was rummaging through my jewelry box, and lo and behold, I found this. And then I knew what she was talking about. When I was a Girl Scout, we had little cubes of soft marble, and we carved things in them. And I carved this when I was around 10 years old to give to my mother, and this is what she was talking about, the soft marble cross that the soldiers carved for their nurses, their favorite nurses. And in case you think that the Civil War has come and gone, it hasn't. This hoop belongs to me. It is my hoop. And I was, when I was a teenager in '58, I went to a grand ball. It was a Christmas cotillion, and I had to have a white dress, and so I bought a bridal dress, and it required a hoop. Now, those of you who grew up in the '50s remember crinolines, petticoats, hoops, right? I took a look at my ball gown, and it's a classic replica of a Civil War ball gown. I remember I had to wear a corset. It was a hook-eye, not the scarlet hair, hook-eye, lace, and it had garters. It was strapless. But my dress was like this, and it had the cap sleeves, a tight waist, a big, big full skirt, and it had sequins on it and whatever. I thought, my gosh, that's unbelievable. I can't believe it. And then I remembered, of course, I had the hoop, and that's where my hoop came from. Like 100 years ago at Relief Services, right? She would not have worn a hoop in the hospital setting. Dix was very strong about this, and I doubt Sarah would have worn a hoop. They are extremely dangerous. Many women died if they were on a boat landing sometimes, or in a railroad station. If you're standing by the tracks and a train or a gust of wind came by, particularly on a boat landing, if a big gust of wind came by, you could pick up the hoop and completely blow you right over. And of course, in the water, you're as dead as a doornail. They couldn't swim anyway because they probably never learned, but all about 10 pounds of clothing on, you're just sunk. And that's what happened. Also, of course, the hoop was designed, originally women wore about 10 layers of petticoats to create this stuck-out thing. And finally, someone decided to build a hoop because it was easier. You could still stick out, but not have to carry all that weight. So the hoop was developed to stick out because they'd been adding layer and layer from the colonial periods onwards. But also, it's very dangerous especially if you were in a campfire or around a hearth. If you went by and you brushed the coals, it was easy to ignite your skirt, and especially in summer where they would have light muslin. And they said Longfellow's wife died of burns when she was sitting at a desk and was putting a signet on. She had a candle wax and was making a signet on a letter, and the candle fell. And it fell on her dress. Well, you can imagine trying to get down here. You know, you're sitting at a desk, you're trying to move and get out. By the time he came in to put the fire out, she was ignited, and she was really burnt. And she probably died weeks later because they had no treatment for burns. He himself got burned, and they said he wore a beard to cover up the scars from the burn. So it was dangerous. Longfellow, poet Longfellow, Henry Longfellow. I don't know if that's true. That's what I heard by the grapevine.
I have no idea, and that's why I'm asking. Why, two questions. Why so many layers, and why the hoop? Is it just the style, or the function?
No, well, the function, now I'm not positive because I never researched out costume, but I could guess from wearing this thing. The hoop was developed, I think, because women were putting layer and layer and layer of petticoats underneath to give it a bouffant look, so they could accentuate your waist. You have a real tight waist. And then someone decided that the hoop would save you all that heavy layer, and you'd still stick out. So that's why they wore the hoop. The hoop actually is not, it's comfortable. As a matter of fact, when I first presented this, it was in August, and it was the first time I had the hoop on, and it was really hot. I was standing there going like this. And my friend told me later it was distracting because people were watching. I said, I can see a Victorian mother going, will you stop waving your hoop? Stand still. But there are other things I had to figure out, which was, how the heck do you go to the bathroom with this thing? And we came to I had as many theories as I had solutions. One person said, well, they didn't drink much, so they were dehydrated, so they didn't have to go very much anyway. And we decided they'd never had their menstrual cycle because they were either lactating or pregnant, so they never had to worry about that. And then I talked to someone who had done some research in women hygiene, the development of the sanitary napkin and other hygiene factors. And I said, all right, give me the cue, how do they do it? And he said, well, number one, when they wore the hoop, they did not have pants. Bloomers and pants that we know came later on, not during the time of the hoop. So they would just straddle. It just stood. You went outside and that was it. You know, there was no bathroom. Because I said, you can't possibly fit in those little outhouses. And I said, well, what about the next thing? What about the number two? And he said, well, that's what you get service for. He said, you would lift up your hoop, and then you'd squat, and they'd wipe you. And he said that the men in that era would, he said one reason that women left after dining was there was a cabinet, and men would just go over to this teapot and would just pee in the corner. The women had to go outside, whatever, find a trench. Or maybe that's why they didn't need a drink much out in public. I don't know. But these details I had to work out because in getting into this thing, I had to figure out, this is, how do they do it, type of thing.
And how about sitting comfortably?
Well, sitting is easy. That's not quite so hard. You notice that the Victorian sofas and the love seats and the chairs are very big, and they're just for one person. And all you do is you just pull this up. You just gather it up, and it does fold. It collapses like an accordion, and you can just sit. It's not that hard to sit. You pull it up and sit down, and then it just spreads out, like that. It's just like in, the 1600s, where the women stuck out this way, with those bustiers, I guess they call them. Oh, you didn't learn to sit right. You had to fold. You weren't properly trained. Your mother never taught you. But you can do great things underneath. You can hide all sorts of little I don't know. It's really interesting to get into the costume because you understand a lot of the problems. Yeah.
I will tell you that during the Civil War, with my research, the hoop very slowly went out, and the buckle came in.
Yeah.
Because the camp followers were tying notes on their hoops to smuggle them in, and no guard would say, lift their skirt.
Oh.
Also, the pantaloons had no pockets until very late in the century. They waistband and these lovely legs with the lace around the
Oh, I see.
And I think the biggest thing that I see in modern days was up in Auckland or Rockport is a wonderful antique produce store up there, and this woman had a massive blouse on Silicon Valley, and it had eight and blue coming down. Gosh, that is a gorgeous blouse. Very big figure. She said, the pantaloons upside down.
Well, the Victorian era is it's a wide, unfortunately, or fortunately, Victoria lived for a long time, but it's really broken down into many years. The true Victorian of Charles Dickens's time probably is 1830 to 1860. That's probably the Victorian era. After the Civil War, the 70s, certainly the 80s, and definitely the 90s, Edwardian era, that was no more related to the Victorian era than the 20th century is. There was no doubt that after the 90s, that was the 20th century. So there's a dramatic, after the Civil War, it's like a curtain just dropped and everything changed dramatically. But also after the telegraph and then eventually the telephone in the 90s, letter writing was almost dead. And if you read the letter writing from these people in the Civil War, some of them are so elegant. I cannot believe these common people and the way they could write. And it's really sad because a lot of the stuff that they're writing on, the paper that they're writing on, is deteriorating quickly. And we're going to lose all that information very quickly because of the decaying process. And yet it's the only time in our history, probably in the history of mankind, that the little man could really be heard. I mean, you really can hear the little man. And it's really, I just wish people would get into their attics and start translating and transcribing and copying all these letters because they're going to lose it in about another 50 years probably. And even I could see worm marks in a lot of her letters, and I could see it looks like a burn eating its way through. Because see, they put a preservative on the paper so you could write on it, but in doing that, it's acid-based and it's destroying everything. And even the books, you read in some of those beautiful bound books, and the pages are so fragile, some of them are just falling apart. They're being eaten away. And it's a real problem with historians. They really don't know what to do. You can't microfilm a lot of this stuff because the microfilm, they haven't got the perfect match for microfilm to know how to preserve it. And they're really frantically trying. And there are literally millions of letters and diaries and journals that are just begging to be heard if they could just get to it and start preserving them. But they can't even begin to touch the quantity out there. And it's really, as I said, it's pathetic because it's really the little man's voice in this era that is really being heard when you read these letters.